Good evening, lovers of history and the world's strange turning points. Tonight we step into Berlin, August 1936, where the air smells of coal smoke, hot asphalt, and fresh paint still drying on stone facades. Flags hang like curtains. Brass bands rehearse scales that bounce off government buildings. At street level, the city feels almost tidy, as if someone has swept the century under a rug. This is not just sport. It's a stage, built for cameras and foreign eyes. Germany has been Nazi-ruled for 3 years, and the regime understands something modern. If you can choreograph what the world sees, you can soften what the world knows. The Olympics arrive like a perfect excuse, an international festival with rules, rituals, and a ready-made audience. Think less games, more premiere night, with stadium lights instead of spotlights. In cafes, Berliners lower their voices when politics enters the room, then raise them again when a waiter passes. A clerk in a starched shirt tells himself he's only stamping forms, not helping a machine. Joseph Goebbels, propaganda minister, carries a different private tension. He needs applause that sounds voluntary. Adolf Hitler's conflict is colder. He craves legitimacy abroad without surrendering control at home. Outside the new Olympic Stadium, you can hear hammers, boots, and the soft click of a photographer's shutter, already testing angles. The world is arriving, and Berlin is ready to perform, unless the performance is interrupted by something unscripted. At Anhalter Bahnhof, suitcases thump onto platforms. American reporters smell cigars and opportunity. French diplomats smell risk. A Jewish shopkeeper watches the banners and thinks of a different kind of flag, one that can mark a door for destruction. Abroad, boycott talk has faded, not because fears vanished, but because distance makes cruelty easier to debate than to stop. Berlin's planners have rehearsed this like theater, where visitors will walk, what they will read, which faces will greet them. But history has a habit of wandering off script. In a few days, a torch will enter the stadium, and with it, a question the regime cannot fully control. What happens when the world is watching and the wrong person wins? Morning in Berlin begins with trams squealing around corners and newspaper boys shouting headlines that sound like commands. In the early 1930s, this city had tasted hunger and humiliation. The Great Depression slammed Germany hard. Wages shrank, savings evaporated, and respectable men learned the shame of pawn tickets. In smoky back rooms, people argued about Marx and monarchy, while outside, street fights made politics physical. Out of that bruised routine came a promise: order. The Nazi movement sold it with uniforms, marches, and the comforting illusion that someone, finally, was in charge. A factory foreman, no fanatic, just tired, tells himself, if they stop the chaos, maybe my children can sleep. That's the inner bargain of the era, trading fear of instability for trust in a brutal cure. When Hitler becomes chancellor in 1933, the state moves fast. Laws tighten. Opponents disappear into protective custody. The radio, cheap, everywhere, turns speeches into furniture in the home. Even the weathered stone of Berlin seems to listen. Yet the Olympics were not a Nazi invention. Berlin had won the right to host back in 1931, when Germany was still courting democracy's approval. That accident of timing becomes opportunity. The regime looks at the coming games the way an ambitious producer looks at a struggling show. Rewrite the script, recast the city, and sell a new image overseas. A bureaucrat in the sports ministry feels two pressures at once: deliver perfection and never embarrass the men above him. The stadium rises from earth and ambition, and with every new row of seats, the world's invitation becomes harder to refuse. Soon, the invitations will be accepted, and so will the terms, whether anyone reads the fine print or not. On the construction site, limestone dust coats tongues. Workers rinse it down with thin beer. Overseers bark schedules, then soften their tone when foreign inspectors arrive, smiling like hotel managers. Rumors move faster than cement. Americans debating a boycott, British newspapers asking about Jews, the International Olympic Committee insisting, politely, that sport be above politics. The regime nods, promises, and keeps building. And behind the scaffolding, another build begins, of stories, images, and careful omissions, ready to wrap Berlin like a banner when the first delegations step off the train. In the weeks before the games, Berlin undergoes a makeover so thorough it feels like a lie you can smell. Fresh flowers appear in window boxes. Police redirect traffic with theatrical patience. And certain signs, sharp, ugly ones, vanish overnight. Jews not wanted disappears from parks and cafes. Not because hatred has cooled, but because hatred has learned to whisper when guests are present. Goebbels calls this tact. In private, he worries about humiliation. If the world comes and recoils, the regime loses the very legitimacy it craves. So he orders the city to behave. The Gestapo can wait, the cameras cannot. A hotel manager receives instructions on how to greet English visitors, and a shopkeeper is told to smile as if his wages were rising. For Berlin's Jewish residents, the sudden politeness is its own kind of cruelty. A woman in a small apartment hears marching songs outside and folds a dress that no longer feels safe to wear. Her inner conflict is simple and brutal. Leave now and abandon everything familiar, or stay and hope this temporary tightening will pass. Meanwhile, her non-Jewish neighbor repeats the new line. Germany is merely misunderstood because it makes life easier. Even the Olympic Village is designed as persuasion. Neat houses, clean beds, good food, friendly guides. Visitors will see what the regime chooses to show. They will not see the concentration camps already operating. Dachau has been open since 1933 because those places are not part of the tour. And then there is the torch. The relay from Olympia to Berlin, a romantic invention with ancient perfume, is planned to feel timeless. It will also be a moving billboard across Europe. When the flame begins its journey, the stage lights will come up, and Berlin's performance will officially start. Along the route, villagers lean on fence posts, tasting dust kicked up by bicycles and motorcycles that escort the runner. A young torchbearer tells himself he is serving peace, not politics, because the alternative is admitting he's advertising power. Each handoff is photographed, each cheer counted like votes. By the time the flame nears Berlin, the city has rehearsed its smiles. But a smile, held too long, becomes a strain. And soon, under the stadium's roar, that strain will meet something the regime cannot edit in real time. Across the Atlantic, the argument happens in paneled rooms that smell of cigar smoke and ink. Amateur officials shuffle papers, not realizing they're handling something heavier than athletics. The question is blunt. Can the United States attend an Olympics hosted by a regime that openly persecutes its citizens? Avery Brundage, head of the American Olympic Committee, insists sport must remain apolitical. That phrase is soothing, like a blanket over a fire. His inner conflict, though, is real. Admit politics matters, and he risks splitting his own movement. Deny it, and he risks being used. Opponents of participation point to Germany's anti-Jewish measures and to athletes quietly pushed aside. Supporters speak of fairness, rules, and the fear that a boycott would punish competitors more than dictators. Germany plays this debate like a chess game. The regime allows a carefully chosen few Jewish athletes into view, a hint of inclusion meant for foreign consumption. Fencer Helene Mayer, a German of Jewish ancestry, is permitted to compete, an elegant exception that looks, in photographs, like proof of tolerance. Meanwhile, high jumper Gretel Bergmann is brought back from exile only to be excluded before the final team is announced. Inclusion, here, is a prop. Exclusion, a policy. The International Olympic Committee visits, is shown tidy streets and polite officials, and returns with reassurances. The games will proceed. Money and momentum help. So does wishful thinking. It is easier, for many governments, to treat Berlin as a venue rather than a warning. By late 1935 and early 1936, the decision hardens. Teams will go. Athletes begin to train as if politics were weather, something unfortunate but distant. And soon they will step into Berlin's gleaming sets, where every handshake is staged and every medal will mean more than medal. Telegram wires hum with confirmations. Newspapers print schedules beside small, easily ignored reports of arrests. In locker rooms, runners tape ankles and tell themselves they're only racing time, not ideology. A German organizer, sweating in a summer suit, whispers to a colleague that the worst must stay hidden until the guests leave, because he fears a scandal more than he fears injustice. The ships and trains are already moving. And once they arrive, Berlin will offer the world front-row seats to a show that can't be paused, only watched. August 1st, 1936. The Olympic Stadium is a bowl of stone and sunlight, the air thick with dust, perfume, and the sharp tang of sweat. Tens of thousands rise and sit like a single organism. Loudspeakers crackle. Far above, flags ripple. Germany's alongside the rings, a visual compromise that hides the fact that one symbol is devouring the other. The torch arrives, carried into the stadium by Fritz Schilgen, chosen as much for his graceful stride as for any athletic resume. When the flame touches the cauldron, the crowd exhales. It is an invented tradition, newly minted and instantly believable. Exactly the kind of ritual propaganda loves. Hitler watches from the Führer's box, expression trained into authority. His inner conflict is not doubt but calculation. He wants the world to feel awe, not fear, and awe is easier to sell when the audience is already cheering. Around him sit officials who dread embarrassment like a physical pain. Goebbels listens to the roar and thinks in headlines. Then the parade of nations. Athletes march in uniforms that smell of starch and travel. Some delegations raise arms in what can be read as the Olympic salute, or, from certain angles, the Nazi one. Ambiguity becomes useful. The cameras catch it all. Leni Riefenstahl's crews, commissioned to film the games, glide like predators with tripods and lenses, turning sport into cinema. For a moment, Berlin seems to have done it. A peaceful festival in a nation that insists it is merely proud. But ceremonies are safe because nothing is contested. The real test begins when the stopwatch clicks, when bodies collide, when a judge must choose a winner. And in the next days, the regime will discover that competition has a stubborn habit. It produces outcomes no speech can fully command. Outside, vendors sell sausages that hiss on grills, and foreign tourists buy postcards of a new Germany, as if they were souvenirs from a fair. A British attaché scribbles notes, torn between professional caution and the seductive calm of a well-managed crowd. A German policeman, polished boots reflecting the afternoon, tells himself the world will respect strength, because he fears the alternative, being laughed at again. Night falls, searchlights rake the sky, and Berlin's streets glow like a set after rehearsals. Tomorrow the games will stop being a promise and start becoming a record, and records, unlike speeches, can be read by anyone. The Olympic Village sits outside Berlin like a model town. Trim lawns, identical houses, streets named for virtues. In the dining hall, plates clatter, languages overlap, and the smell of boiled cabbage mixes with coffee strong enough to cut through jet lag. Guides smile too widely. It's hospitality with instructions. For many athletes, the village feels like relief. No politics, just training. But even here, boundaries travel. The American team brings its own contradictions. Black athletes who cannot eat in certain restaurants back home are photographed in Berlin shaking hands with Germans who, in other contexts, would deny basic rights to their own minorities. The regime's conflict is practical. Officials must be courteous to people their ideology devalues, because the camera is a stricter boss than dogma, for now. A German sports administrator, educated, ambitious, walks past the track and thinks, with a tight jaw, let them lose quickly. He believes in the Aryan myth because it gives him status in a world he once felt excluded from. An American coach, meanwhile, worries less about doctrine than about distraction. If my runners become symbols, will they still run free? That's the pressure of Berlin, turning bodies into messages. In the evenings, athletes trade pins and stories under lamplight. Others sit alone on porch steps, rubbing sore calves, listening to insects and distant train whistles. From the city, marching songs sometimes drift across the fields, faint but unmistakable, like a reminder that the party has a uniform. Foreign journalists roam for color. German handlers roam for control. One name begins to circulate in whispers, not as a legend yet, but as a possibility. Jesse Owens, a sprinter and jumper from Ohio with astonishing speed. Berlin doesn't know what to do with him. And soon, as the starter's pistol cracks in the heat, the games will begin to write a story the regime never planned to publish. At dawn, the track is damp, the air cool enough to see breath. Spikes click on cinders, and each sprint leaves a brief scar in the surface that a groundskeeper rakes smooth, as if erasing evidence. A German liaison officer watches the Americans and feels a flicker of dread, because myths are fragile when they meet measurable time. The first heats are only hours away, and Berlin's polished stage is about to face the most democratic force of all, a finish line. The cinder track is dark and granular, like ground pepper. When spikes dig in, you hear a dry crunch, then the sudden hush before the pistol. Berlin's crowd, so loud during ceremony, becomes almost reverent at the moment of start, because even propaganda respects suspense. And then the timing begins to misbehave. Jesse Owens wins the 100 meters with a speed that turns ideology into comedy, if you let it. Cameras catch a Black American crossing first in a stadium built to celebrate a master race. In the stands, some Germans cheer anyway. The human impulse to admire excellence slips past official messaging. A party official, face rigid, tells himself the real victory is Germany's organization, not the winner, because he fears what a simple result might imply. Hitler, according to multiple accounts, initially congratulated some winners in person. The International Olympic Committee then pressed him. He must greet every champion or greet none. The next day, he chooses none. It's a small retreat disguised as protocol, but it reveals his conflict. He wants to be seen as a gracious host without validating the wrong victors. Then comes the long jump. Owens nearly fouls out in qualifying, and a German jumper, Luz Long, speaks with him, later remembered as offering advice about a safer takeoff. Long's own pressure is visible in his posture. He is competing for Germany before the eyes of the Führer, yet he also wants to be simply an athlete. When Owens wins and Long takes silver, they walk together, a quiet scene that no banner can quite erase. Goebbels' office moves quickly. If the winners do not match the script, the framing must. The games become a lesson in modern image control, not changing reality, but changing what reality means. And as medals pile up, Berlin learns that the simplest arithmetic of sport, first, second, third, can produce political headaches. The regime will not stop the competitions. It will try something subtler, to swallow the surprises and keep smiling. For now. But the next events will test whether a smile can stay fixed when the world begins to notice the cracks. If the track is where Berlin gets embarrassed, the rest of the program is where Berlin regains control. In the gymnastics hall, chalk dust hangs in sunbeams and settles on shoulders like powder snow. German athletes, drilled and disciplined, move with precision that flatters the regime's self-image. Equestrian events, Old World, officer class, deliver more German victories. The medal table becomes a headline Germany can point to, and Hitler can nod at without straying. Meanwhile, the spectacle spreads through technology. Berlin experiments with television. In television rooms around the city, people crowd into dim halls to watch live images flicker on small screens. The room smells of damp coats and warm circuitry. A man who can't afford a ticket stares at the ghostly athletes and feels included, proud, almost modern. The regime understands this too. Mass experience is power. Leni Riefenstahl's cameras chase bodies like sculpture in motion, low angles, dramatic compositions, slow attention to muscle and symmetry. Her inner conflict is complicated. She wants to make art that will outlive politics, yet she needs the state's money, access, and permission. Each elegant shot is also a service rendered. She tells herself she is filming beauty, not ideology, because that story keeps her hands clean. Foreign visitors drift through Berlin's renovated streets at night, tasting beer in bright halls, listening to jazz that the regime tolerates for the weak, like a guilty pleasure. A British tourist writes home that Germany seems orderly, friendly, efficient. That's the performance working. It doesn't erase persecution, it delays outrage. And outside the spotlight, the machinery keeps its rhythm. Jews remain marked by law, even if signs are temporarily removed. Political prisoners remain behind fences, even if the postcards are pretty. The games are not a pause in Nazi policy. They are a curtain drawn across it. Soon the curtain will lift again. And when the visitors leave, Berlin's politeness will have less reason to pretend. Berlin's newspapers roll off presses at dawn, ink still wet, headlines already shaped by censors and enthusiasm. Foreign correspondents file stories from hotel rooms where the air is hot and the curtains never quite close. Some write about sport. Others, more cautious, write between the lines, about the strange absence of anti-Jewish slogans, about the ever-present uniforms, about how order can feel like surveillance. The world, meanwhile, is not calm. In July 1936, Spain falls into civil war, and the People's Olympiad planned in Barcelona, meant as an anti-fascist alternative to Berlin, collapses under gunfire and confusion. The Soviet Union stays away from the games altogether. Europe is full of nervous systems firing, alliances, ideologies, rumors. Yet the Olympics offer a comforting counterimage. Nations lining up peacefully, as if conflict can be postponed by ceremony. A German diplomat, sipping thin wine at a reception, feels a private dread. Germany is rearming. Germany has just remilitarized the Rhineland in March, and Germany needs time. The games buy time. Time to normalize the regime, to make aggression look like confidence. A foreign politician, shaking hands for photographers, tells himself engagement is practical because admitting danger would demand action he isn't ready to take. The propaganda is not only in speeches, it's in logistics. Visitors are escorted along clean routes. Questions are answered with polite vagueness. A correspondent who probes too hard risks losing credentials. His inner conflict is familiar to anyone who has covered power. Tell the full truth and lose access, or keep access and lose yourself. As the final days approach, the stadium is still full, the band still loud, and Berlin's smile still intact. But outside the Olympic calendar, the real one keeps turning. The games will end. The guests will go home. And Germany will wake up to itself again, with fewer reasons to hide. In a corridor, you can hear a typewriter clacking like rain, someone logging names, someone noting who spoke to whom. A young German interpreter smiles all evening, then goes home and scrubs the day from his skin, afraid a careless sentence could cost him everything. The closing ceremony is coming. And after the last flag is folded, Berlin's theater will pack up, leaving the stage for something far less decorative. The closing ceremony has the weary sweetness of a festival's last night. The stadium lights soften, the crowd's roar becomes affectionate rather than hungry, and athletes, no longer marching by nation, mix on the field in a designed gesture of unity. Dust rises from their shoes and hangs in the air like a memory. Berlin wants the world to leave with that image. Bodies together, flags lowered, peace implied. Germany tops the medal table, 89 medals, 33 gold, just ahead of the United States in total count. It's an achievement with real athletic merit and enormous political utility. Hitler's public face stays composed, but inside he feels something close to vindication. The regime has hosted, dazzled, and avoided a diplomatic revolt. Goebbels, ever restless, thinks of the next audience, the next script, the next set to build. Then the city exhales. Trains pull out of stations with a sigh of steam. Hotel lobbies empty. The Olympic Village grows quiet, plates stacked, beds stripped, laughter replaced by the sound of a broom. In the streets, the temporary flowers begin to wilt. The politeness, too, has an expiration date. A Jewish shopkeeper notices the first sign reappear, as if someone has returned a weapon to its rack. His inner conflict hardens into resignation. Hope feels irresponsible, but despair feels like surrender. A Berlin policeman, no longer performing for foreigners, slips back into the old tone, short, suspicious, efficient. The week of peace has ended, and the state's true posture returns like a familiar ache. The world takes home souvenirs and stories. Some take home warnings. But governments, like tired travelers, often prefer comfort to confrontation. Germany has learned something precious. Spectacle can anesthetize. And the regime is already planning how to use that lesson, beyond stadiums, beyond medals, into the future that is gathering speed. In offices across Europe, officials file reports and decide to watch and wait. In Berlin, the planners pack away flags and keep the blueprints. The next performance will not require tickets, only obedience. And it is closer than anyone wants to admit. After the athletes leave, Berlin's rhythm changes. The streets are still wide, the cafes still serve coffee, but the city feels watched again. In a government office, ceiling fans push warm air in lazy circles while clerks stamp papers with mechanical certainty. The stamp is small, but it can decide a life. Permission, denial, exit, entrapment. The Nazi state is, above all, administrative. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 have already defined Jews as outsiders by blood, not belief. Now those definitions become daily practice: marriage rules, job bans, school exclusions, a tightening net made of forms. A civil servant tells himself he is only following regulations because the alternative is to face his own complicity. His inner conflict is not dramatic, it is ordinary, and that ordinariness is what makes it dangerous. Internationally, the Olympics have helped, not by convincing everyone, but by dulling urgency. Diplomats who once argued about boycott now argue about trade. Newspapers move on. The game's images, smiling Germans, sleek stadiums, the torch's romantic glow, linger in public memory like a pleasant tune. Meanwhile, Germany continues to rearm, and propaganda continues to standardize thought. There are those who see through it. Some journalists write sharper editorials. Some visitors tell uneasy stories at dinner tables. But warning competes with fatigue, and fatigue wins more often than we like. In democratic capitals, leaders juggle budgets, elections, and the hope that Germany's aggression can be managed with patience. They fear war, and fear makes people bargain. Berlin, for its part, has tasted international attention and found it intoxicating. The regime learns to calibrate cruelty, when to shout, when to whisper, when to smile for the camera, and when to strike in the dark. The world has turned the page. Yet the ink is still wet, and the next chapter will not be written in a stadium, but on borders and in treaties, where applause is replaced by silence. In a dark editing room, the 1936 games continue long after the last medal is handed out. Film reels spin with a soft hiss, frames flashing on a screen like a heartbeat. A cutter's hands smell of acetate and cigarette smoke. Here, time is malleable. A jump can be slowed into poetry. A crowd can be made to look unanimous. A city can be frozen at its most flattering angle. Leni Riefenstahl shapes the footage into Olympia, released in 1938, and it is technically groundbreaking. Fluid camera movement, daring angles, bodies treated like classical art. Her conflict, again, is the old one: art versus patron. She wants the film to be about athletic beauty, but the state wants it to be about Germany's centrality, Germany's modernity, Germany's right to be admired. Even when the film lingers on non-German champions, it still makes Berlin feel like the center of gravity, the place where the world gathers to be defined. Goebbels understands the leverage. A rally ends when people go home. A film can travel. It can be replayed, reinterpreted, and, most importantly, remembered. Propaganda is not only persuasion in the moment, it is architecture for memory. In cinemas, audiences lean back in plush seats, listening to orchestral swells, watching athletes seem almost mythic. The smell of popcorn mixes with the warm ozone of the projector. A viewer can forget the camps and the laws for 90 minutes, because the screen offers a simpler story. Nations together, strength celebrated, conflict dissolved into competition. The editing is a kind of governance. Hold the camera on the torch and not on the police line. Linger on the smiling crowd and not on who isn't allowed in. Make the modern state look like a festival, and the festival look inevitable. That is the quiet trick of political theater. It doesn't always lie. Sometimes it tells the truth, but selects which truths count. Those reels will outlive the stadium's cheers. And they will keep asking a dangerous question. When we admire the picture, what did we agree not to see next? There is a particular quiet after a successful show, the kind you feel backstage when the audience leaves and the performers finally drop their smiles. In Berlin, that quiet is filled with paperwork and planning. In military offices, maps are unrolled, corners pinned down, pencils tracing borders as if borders were suggestions. The rooms smell of leather, tobacco, and stale coffee. Orders move through the bureaucracy with the same efficiency that once moved tourists through clean streets. Hitler's inner conflict, if we can call it that, is a clash between impatience and timing. He wants expansion, he wants it now, but he also wants it to look inevitable, reasonable, even welcomed. The Olympics have helped him believe the world can be managed. They came. The logic goes. They watched. They applauded. They will hesitate again. Elsewhere, leaders rehearse their own lines. In London and Paris, fear of another war sits like a heavy coat. Politicians tell themselves they can bargain for peace, because the alternative is admitting they may have to fight for it. Ordinary people, still remembering the trenches and the graves of the last conflict, prefer any plan that delays violence. That preference becomes policy, and policy becomes momentum. Within 2 years, Germany will annex Austria. Then comes the Sudeten crisis and the Munich Agreement, sold as peace for our time, while Czechoslovakia is carved up. The language is diplomatic, the effect is strategic. Each step is a little easier because the previous step did not produce immediate punishment. That is how theater turns into rehearsal, actions tested before an audience, then repeated with higher stakes. Back in Berlin, some remember the games as the happiest weeks of the decade. That memory is not false, it is incomplete. The same state that could host a festival can also mobilize a war, and both require the same tools: obedience, spectacle, and a story that makes people feel chosen. The world keeps applauding small solutions. But the next act will not end with medals. It will end with borders on fire and trains running for darker reasons. Walk through any modern Olympic ceremony and you can feel the ghost of 1936 in the choreography. The torch relay is now treated as ancient, even though its first long run to the Games was a Berlin invention. Stadiums still favor symmetry, spectacle, and the careful merging of sport with national story. Cameras still hunt the perfect angle. And host nations still understand what Berlin proved. The Games can be a billboard that looks like a celebration. In an International Olympic Committee meeting decades later, the room is carpeted, air-conditioned, and politely tense. An official insists, again, that sport must remain above politics. His inner conflict is familiar. He wants the Olympics to be pure, but he also wants them to happen, and happening requires money, security, and cooperation with whoever holds power. Sponsors want global audiences, governments want legitimacy, broadcasters want drama. The ideals are real. So are the incentives. Neutrality, in practice, is often a negotiation. History after Berlin offers echoes, boycotts, counter-boycotts. Athletes turned into symbols whether they asked for it or not. The point isn't that all hosts are the same. It's that the stage is always tempting. A city can pave streets, clean facades, and open museums for 2 weeks, while keeping its harder truths off camera. Viewers at home taste the spectacle through screens, and the screen is a selective organ. Yet there is also a stubborn resistance inside sport. A race still has a finish line. A jump still has measurable distance. Excellence still has a way of slipping past the messages attached to it. That is why regimes love the Games and fear them in the same breath. Berlin in 1936 did not invent political theater. It simply showed how modern it could be, how sleek, how exportable. And once you've seen that, you start to recognize the lighting cues elsewhere. So the question lingers, quietly, whenever the torch is lit. Are we watching competition, or are we being invited to applaud a story? In the final chapter, we'll return to Berlin streets, where the answers were never entirely hidden, only rearranged. Imagine Berlin a week after the Games. Not the postcard Berlin, but the ordinary one. Rain turning dust to paste along the curb, trams throwing sparks in the dusk, the Olympic posters peeling at the corners. The stadium sits enormous and quiet, its stones still warm from summer sun, like a shell after the sea is pulled back. Somewhere inside, a janitor sweeps up confetti that feels, suddenly, like evidence. In a small apartment, a family listens to the radio again, not for medal updates, but for the familiar cadence of speeches and decrees. A father who enjoyed the Games feels a twinge of guilt he can't name. His conflict is the one many people carry in dangerous times. He wants normal life, and he wants to believe normal life can be kept separate from what the state does to others. A Jewish neighbor reads new notices and understands that the polite week was not a change of heart, only a change of costume. If you follow the story forward, you know what comes: a Europe consumed, millions murdered, cities burned, the word Berlin attached to ruins instead of ribbons. In that light, it's tempting to treat 1936 as a simple warning sign. But history rarely gives us simple signs. It gives us crowded stadiums and tidy streets and moments that feel, in the present, like celebrations. It teaches that propaganda doesn't always look like a threat. Sometimes it looks like a festival you'd happily attend. The 1936 Olympics were political theater, yes, but also human theater. Ambitions, fears, compromises, and the seductive comfort of being entertained while something darker waits behind the set. That is why the story still echoes. Not because we are doomed to repeat it, but because we are always capable of applauding the wrong thing for the right reasons. So when the lights dim and the torch is carried out, listen for what remains after the cheers. In Berlin, it was the sound of doors closing again. And in our own time, the next door is always nearby, quietly, already opening.